What if the only person who told a billionaire to stay silent was the one trying to save his life? "Don't make a sound." The whisper was barely audible, but in the dark hallway of his own mansion, it hit like a command. Omar al-Rashid froze. He had returned hours early. No calls, no warnings. And now, his maid was standing in front of him, pale, shaking, her eyes locked onto his like she had just seen something she couldn't unsee. "Please, sir," she breathed, her voice trembling. "If they hear you, it's over." From down the corridor, a faint noise echoed, a drawer sliding open, a voice that didn't belong. Omar's jaw tightened, because in that moment, he realized something was terribly wrong. Not outside, but inside his own home. Before we go any further, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe, because this story might change the way you see trust forever. Omar al-Rashid was not the kind of man who believed in accidents. At 38, he had built a reputation that stretched far beyond the glass towers of Manhattan, where his company's name stood engraved in steel. People called him precise, ruthless, calculated. A man who trusted numbers more than people and silence more than promises. In a world that thrived on noise, Omar had learned early that power often moved quietly. Born into wealth but raised in discipline, Omar had never allowed privilege to soften him. His father, a powerful businessman from the Middle East, had made sure of that. Nothing was handed to him freely. Every lesson came with a cost. Every mistake left a mark. By the time Omar inherited his family's expanding empire, he had already proven himself capable of running it better than anyone expected. Under his leadership, the company grew faster, sharper, and more guarded. Deals were made behind closed doors. Rivals disappeared without confrontation. And trust, real trust, became something Omar reserved for no one. Especially not the people inside his own home. The mansion he lived in sat on the outskirts of the city, hidden behind iron gates and rows of towering trees that blocked out the world beyond. It was less a home and more a fortress, quiet, controlled, and carefully monitored. Every employee was screened, every room maintained, every detail accounted for. And yet, even in a place built on control, there were cracks. Grace Miller had noticed them long before anyone else. She was 27 years old, though the weight she carried made her seem older. Life had not given her the luxury of softness. Every day was a balance between survival and hope, and she had learned to move through it quietly, without drawing attention. Grace worked as a maid in Omar's mansion, a position she had fought hard to keep. To most of the staff, she was invisible. Just another uniform moving through the halls, cleaning rooms that weren't hers, handling objects she would never own. The other employees rarely spoke to her unless they had to. Some ignored her entirely. Others made sure she remembered exactly where she stood. At the center of it all was Harold Bennett, the head butler, a man in his 50s with a posture as stiff as his rules and a voice that carried authority even when he whispered. Harold had been with the household for years, long before Grace arrived. He knew every system, every schedule, every weakness, and he never let anyone forget it. "Keep your head down, Grace," he had told her on her first day, his tone polite but cold. "People who ask too many questions don't last long here." Grace had taken that advice seriously, because she couldn't afford not to. Every paycheck she earned went somewhere else, to a small hospital room across town where her 6-year-old daughter, Lily, spent most of her days. Lily had been born with a heart condition that required constant care, regular treatment, and more money than Grace had ever imagined needing. Working in the mansion wasn't just a job. It was the only thing standing between her daughter and uncertainty. So she endured. The whispers, the judgment, the long hours, the moments when someone would glance at her worn shoes or her tired eyes and decide, without knowing anything, exactly what she was worth. Grace said nothing. She worked. She listened. And over time, she started noticing things. Small things at first. A door that was supposed to stay locked, left slightly open. A file moved from one desk to another when no one had been scheduled to enter the room. Conversations that stopped the moment she walked by. At first, she told herself it was nothing. A misunderstanding. A coincidence. But the patterns didn't go away. They grew. And then Omar left for what was supposed to be a 3-day business trip. The house shifted the moment he was gone. Schedules became looser. Certain rooms were accessed more frequently. Harold moved differently, less careful, more confident. Grace tried to ignore it. She had learned that survival often meant not seeing what wasn't meant for her. But one night, while cleaning the upper hallway, she heard something that made her stop. Voices. Coming from the study. Omar's private office. No one was allowed in there without permission. Grace knew that. Everyone did. And yet, the door was slightly open. A sliver of light spilled into the hallway. She hesitated. Every instinct told her to walk away. But something about the tone of the voices pulled her closer. Not loud, not angry. Controlled. Careful. Dangerous. Grace took one step forward, then another, just enough to hear. "He won't be back until Friday," a voice said. Harold's. There was a pause. Then another voice responded. Lower, unfamiliar. "You're sure?" "I control the schedule," Harold replied calmly. "Nothing happens in this house without me knowing." Grace's breath caught in her throat. Her hand tightened around the cloth she was holding. Because in that moment, she understood something she wasn't supposed to. This wasn't just a conversation, it was a plan. A plan that depended on Omar not being there. And if they knew he was gone, what were they looking for? Grace stepped back slowly, her heart racing. She didn't stay long enough to hear more. She didn't need to. From that night on, everything felt different. Every sound echoed louder. Every shadow seemed longer. And every time Harold passed by her, his eyes lingered just a second too long. As if he knew. As if he was waiting for her to make a mistake. Grace didn't tell anyone. She couldn't. Not without proof. Not without risking everything. So she waited. Watched. Listened. And hoped that Omar would return before whatever was happening inside that house reached its end. But what Grace didn't know, what no one in that house knew, was that Omar al-Rashid had already decided to come back early, without warning, without announcement, and without trusting a single person inside his own home. The rain started before Omar reached the gates. It came down in steady sheets, blurring the long stretch of road that led to the mansion, turning the world outside into something distant and indistinct. The wipers moved rhythmically across the windshield, but even they couldn't clear the feeling pressing in on him. Something was wrong. Omar didn't believe in instincts the way other people did. He believed in patterns, in evidence, in decisions built on facts. But tonight, he couldn't ignore the tension coiled tightly in his chest. He hadn't told anyone he was coming back. Not his assistant, not his security team, not even Harold. The decision had been made in the quiet of his hotel room, hours earlier, after a message appeared on his private device, one that wasn't connected to any of his official channels. No name, no trace, just a single line. "You should see what happens in your house when you're gone." Omar had stared at the message for a long time. Then he booked the first flight back. Now, as his car rolled past the iron gates, opened automatically by a system that still recognized his vehicle, he noticed something that immediately sharpened his focus. The lights were on. Not just one or two. Nearly the entire lower level of the mansion was illuminated. At this hour, the house should have been quiet, minimal staff, limited activity, controlled. Instead, it looked active, alive. Omar pulled the car to a stop without turning off the engine right away. He watched, waited. The rain tapped steadily against the glass. No one came out to greet him. No security approached. No movement at the front entrance. That alone was enough to confirm it. The routine had been broken, and in Omar's world, a broken routine was never accidental. He turned off the engine. The sudden silence made the sound of the rain feel louder. He stepped out of the car, his shoes meeting the wet pavement with quiet precision, and closed the door without slamming it. Every movement was deliberate, measured. If someone inside didn't know he was here yet, he intended to keep it that way. Omar approached the front door, his expression unreadable, his mind already calculating possibilities. The keypad unlocked at his touch. The door opened smoothly, and the moment he stepped inside, he knew. The air felt different, subtle, but undeniable. The scent of cleaning supplies lingered faintly in the hallway, mixed with something else, something sharper, metallic. He closed the door behind him without a sound, listened. The house, despite the lights, was too quiet. Not empty, but quiet in a way that felt intentional, as if the silence itself was being maintained. Omar moved forward, his footsteps soft against the polished floor. Then, a shadow shifted at the far end of the hallway. He stopped instantly. A figure stepped into view. Grace. She looked like she had been running. Her uniform slightly disheveled, her breathing uneven. Her face pale under the soft overhead lights. For a brief second, her eyes didn't register who he was. Then they did. And everything changed. Her expression froze. Shock, fear. Something else. Something deeper. "Sir?" she whispered. The word barely left her lips. Omar's gaze sharpened. He studied her the way he studied everything. Carefully, without revealing what he was thinking. Grace took a small step toward him, then another. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides. She glanced over her shoulder, then back at him, and in that moment, Omar noticed it. Not just fear, urgency. "Don't," she started, her voice catching. She swallowed hard, lowering it even further. "Please, don't make a sound." Omar didn't move, didn't speak. But something inside him shifted. Because no one in this house spoke to him like that, not without consequences. And yet, Grace wasn't being disrespectful. She was being careful. Desperate. Her eyes flicked again toward the hallway behind her. "There are people," she whispered, barely audible now. "In your office." Omar's jaw tightened. For a split second, something dangerous flickered in his expression. But Grace reacted instantly. She stepped closer, her voice urgent now, though still quiet. "If they hear you, it's over," she said. "Please, just trust me for 1 minute." Trust. The word landed heavily between them. Omar hadn't trusted anyone in a long time, especially not someone in her position. A maid, an employee, someone with every reason to stay silent, to look away, to survive without getting involved. And yet, here she was, standing in front of him, asking him to stay quiet in his own house. Omar held her gaze for a moment longer, then without a word. He nodded. It was slight, barely noticeable, but it was enough. Grace exhaled softly, relief flickering across her face for just an instant. Then she turned, moving carefully down the hallway, her steps light, controlled. Omar followed. Not closely, but not far enough to lose sight of her either. Every sense was alert now, every detail sharp. As they moved deeper into the house, the faint sound reached him. Voices, low, muffled, coming from the direction of the study. His study. Grace slowed as they approached the corner. She raised her hand slightly, signaling him to stop. Omar did. From where they stood, the door to the study was partially closed. A thin line of light spilled into the hallway, and the voices were clearer now. "You said the code would work," one voice muttered. "Harold." There was no mistaking it. "I said it would give us time," Harold replied calmly. "Not forever." A second voice answered, lower, unfamiliar. "You're pushing this too far." Silence followed. Then the sound of something metal shifting. A drawer, or a safe. Omar's expression hardened, because there was only one thing in that room worth that level of risk: his private safe. Grace glanced back at him, her face tense, as if asking silently, "Now do you understand?" Omar didn't respond, but his eyes had already changed. Cold, focused, dangerous. The kind of look that had ended negotiations, destroyed competitors, and built empires. Because in that moment, there was no longer any doubt. Someone inside his own house was trying to steal from him. The voice inside the study spoke again, quieter this time. "We find it tonight," the stranger said, "or everything falls apart." Omar leaned slightly closer to the wall, listening. Every word now mattered. Every second counted. And for the first time since stepping inside, he realized something that shifted everything. This wasn't just theft. This was something bigger, something planned, something that depended on him not being here. Grace's fingers tightened slightly at her side. She didn't speak, but the tension in her posture said enough. She had known, or at least suspected. Long before he returned. Omar's gaze flicked toward her for a brief moment, then back to the door, because now there was only one question left. What exactly were they looking for inside his safe? Omar didn't rush in. That alone would have surprised anyone who truly understood the kind of man he was. Confrontation had never frightened him. Power had always been his language, and when something belonged to him, he took control of it without hesitation. But tonight, he waited. Because instinct told him this wasn't something that could be handled with force alone. From the narrow strip of light beneath the study door, shadows shifted. The faint scrape of metal echoed again, followed by a quiet curse. "They're changing the system," the unfamiliar voice muttered. "This wasn't part of the plan." Harold exhaled sharply, his composure thinning just slightly. "Calm down," he said. "The primary lock is still manual. I've handled it before." Omar's eyes narrowed. Handled it before. That meant this wasn't the first time. Beside him, Grace stiffened. She leaned closer, just enough for her whisper to reach him without carrying further down the hall. "I told you," she breathed. "They've been coming in here at night." Omar didn't respond, but the confirmation landed heavily. A breach repeated more than once was no longer a mistake. It was a pattern. And patterns could be dismantled. Inside the room, a soft click sounded, then another, followed by a low hum. "The backup's kicking in," the second man said. "We don't have long." Harold's tone dropped lower, more urgent now. "Then stop talking and keep working." Omar shifted his weight slightly, pressing himself closer to the wall. His mind was already running through possibilities. What they were after, how long they'd been at it, who else might be involved. But one question rose above the rest. How much had they already taken? Grace glanced at him again, her eyes searching his face. There was fear there, but also something else. Determination. "I didn't know what to do," she whispered. "I couldn't go to anyone. Harold, he watches everything, even the cameras." Omar's gaze flicked toward her, sharp. "The cameras?" he mouthed silently. She nodded, barely. "He disables some of them," she said softly. "Only for short periods, enough to move without being seen." Omar absorbed that quickly. Selective blind spots, controlled windows. Whoever Harold was working with, this wasn't amateur work. Inside the study, something metallic snapped open, a heavy, unmistakable sound. The safe. Omar's jaw tightened, because there was only one thing inside that safe worth breaking into repeatedly. Sensitive files, encrypted drives, information that could cripple his company if it fell into the wrong hands. "Got it," the stranger said, a note of relief slipping into his voice. "Don't celebrate yet," Harold replied. "We still have to—" The sound cut off abruptly. Silence fell inside the room. Omar's muscles tensed. Beside him, Grace froze. Footsteps. Slow. Measured. Approaching the door. Grace's hand shot out instinctively, gripping Omar's sleeve for just a second before she pulled back, as if realizing what she had done. Too late. The handle inside the study shifted. Omar moved without hesitation. He stepped back into the deeper shadow of the hallway, pulling Grace with him by the arm, pressing them both against the wall just beyond the line of sight from the door. The study door opened slightly. A sliver, then wider. Light spilled into the hallway. A figure stepped out. Not Harold. The other man. He paused just outside the doorway, scanning the corridor. Omar held his breath, not from fear, but from calculation. The man's posture was tense, alert, but not suspicious enough, not yet. After a few seconds, the man exhaled, muttering under his breath. "Clear." He stepped back inside, pulling the door closed behind him. The latch clicked softly into place. Only then did Grace release the breath she had been holding. Her hand trembled slightly as she pressed it against the wall. "They're almost done," she whispered. "Once they leave, everything will be gone." Omar straightened slowly. His mind was no longer just analyzing. It was deciding. He could walk in now. End it immediately. Expose them. But that would only stop tonight. It wouldn't tell him how deep this went. Who else was involved? How long this had been happening? Or what had already been taken? Omar turned his head slightly toward Grace. "You've seen this before," he said quietly, his voice low enough not to carry. She hesitated, then nodded. "Not everything," she admitted. "But enough to know it's wrong." "Why didn't you report it?" he asked. The question was direct, sharp. Grace's eyes dropped for a brief second. When she looked back up, there was something heavier in them now. "I tried," she said. Once. Omar waited, but she didn't continue. Not right away. The silence stretched just long enough to say what words didn't. Who had she tried to tell, and what had happened after? Omar's gaze hardened. Harold? He guessed. Grace swallowed, then nodded again. He told me I misunderstood, she said, that I should focus on my job and stop imagining things. There was a pause, then more quietly. And after that, things changed. Omar didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. The tension in her voice said enough. The way she stood, careful, guarded, said even more. Inside the study, the sounds resumed. Drawers closing. Objects shifting. The operation was nearing its end. Omar exhaled slowly, then made his decision. We let them leave, he said. Grace looked at him, startled. What? She whispered. But if we stop them now, Omar continued calmly, we only catch what's in this room. He held her gaze. I want everything. The weight of those words settled between them. Grace hesitated. Then, slowly, she nodded. Because for the first time since this had begun, she realized Omar wasn't just reacting. He was planning. And whatever was about to happen next would be far bigger than anything Harold expected. From inside the study, Harold's voice rose again. Pack it up, he said. We're done here. Grace's breath caught. Omar's eyes darkened. Because now, the game had truly begun, and the next move would decide everything. Morning arrived as if nothing had happened. The rain had stopped. The sky stretched clear and pale above the estate, and sunlight filtered through the tall windows of Omar al-Rashid's mansion, settling softly across polished floors and perfectly arranged furniture. Everything looked normal. Too normal. Omar stood near the balcony of his private room, one hand resting lightly against the glass as he looked down at the grounds below. Staff moved along their usual routes. Gardeners trimmed hedges. Housekeepers crossed the hallways with lowered heads and steady steps. Routine had returned. Or at least, the illusion of it. Behind him, the events of the previous night lingered like a shadow that refused to fade. He had said nothing. No alarms. No confrontations. Not even a question. And that silence had already started working in his favor. Because if Harold believed the house was still under his control, he would make a mistake. A knock came at the door. Omar didn't turn. Enter. The door opened quietly. Harold stepped in, his posture as impeccable as ever, his expression calm, respectful, controlled. Good morning, sir, he said, inclining his head slightly. We weren't expecting you back so soon. Omar finally turned, his face unreadable. Clearly, he replied. There was no accusation in his tone, no tension, just a simple observation. Harold didn't react, but there was a flicker, brief, almost invisible in his eyes. I trust your trip went well, Harold continued smoothly. It ended early, Omar said. I had reason to return. Another pause. This one slightly longer. Harold's smile remained polite, but something beneath it tightened. Of course, sir, he said. If there's anything you need. There is, Omar interrupted. Harold stopped speaking immediately. Omar stepped away from the window, closing the distance between them with quiet authority. I want all staff present in the main hall in 10 minutes, he said. Harold blinked once, then nodded. Of course. He turned to leave. But before he reached the door, Harold? The name stopped him. He turned back. Yes, sir? Omar held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary, then said, "Make sure no one is late." The words were simple, but the weight behind them was not. Harold inclined his head again. "I understand." And then he left. Omar waited until the door closed before his expression shifted. Just slightly. Because the next part of his plan had already begun. The main hall filled quickly. Staff lined up in neat rows, their uniforms pressed, their expressions carefully neutral. But beneath the surface, tension moved like a quiet current. Unexpected meetings were never a good sign, especially not when Omar al-Rashid called them himself. Grace stood near the back. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, her eyes lowered, not out of submission, but out of caution. She hadn't slept. Not after what she had seen. Not after what she had risked. And now, standing in the same room as Harold, she could feel it. His attention, even without looking. Omar entered the hall without announcement. The room fell silent instantly. He walked to the center, his presence alone enough to command every eye. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence stretch, watched, measured. Then, "I returned earlier than planned," he said. His voice was calm, controlled. "But it seems I missed something." A ripple moved through the room, subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. Omar's gaze moved slowly across the staff, taking in every reaction, every shift in posture, every flicker of discomfort. Then it stopped, on Grace, for just a second, before moving on. "Last night," he continued, "something was taken from this house." The words landed heavily. Gasps didn't follow. No one spoke. But the tension thickened. Because whether they knew or not, they understood what that meant. Omar's tone didn't change. "I am giving the responsible party one opportunity," he said. "Come forward now." Silence, complete, unbroken. Omar nodded slightly, as if he had expected that. "Very well." He turned his head slightly. "Harold?" "Yes, sir?" Harold stepped forward without hesitation. Composed, confident. "There was an incident early this morning," Harold said smoothly. "Before your arrival." Omar raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Harold's expression shifted, just enough to suggest concern. "One of the staff members was found in possession of an item that does not belong to her," he said. A murmur spread through the room. Omar didn't react. "Who?" he asked. Harold turned, slowly, deliberately, and pointed. "Grace Miller." The room froze. Grace didn't move, didn't speak. But something inside her tightened. Because she had known. She had felt it coming. Omar's gaze returned to her. Sharp. Unreadable. "Step forward," he said. Grace hesitated for half a second, then obeyed. Each step felt heavier than the last. Every eye in the room was on her now, judging, waiting, expecting. She stopped a few feet from Omar, her hands still clasped, her breathing steady despite the storm building around her. "Search her bag," Harold said calmly. A staff member stepped forward, reaching, opening, and then a pause. The kind of pause that changed everything. The staff member looked up, then back into the bag. Slowly. He pulled something out. A small velvet box, deep blue, elegant, recognizable. Omar's eyes darkened, because he knew exactly what it was. A family heirloom. Something that had never left his private collection. The room erupted. Whispers. Gasps. Disbelief. "I knew it," someone muttered. "Unbelievable." She looked so quiet. Grace's face went pale. Not from guilt, but from realization. This wasn't coincidence. This was a trap. She looked at Harold. And for the first time, she didn't look afraid. She looked certain. "You planted it," she said quietly. The room fell silent again. Harold's expression didn't change. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you're implying," he replied smoothly. Grace's hands tightened. "You think I didn't notice?" she said, her voice shaking, but not weak. "You've been watching me for weeks, waiting for this." A murmur spread again. Omar didn't interrupt, didn't defend. He simply watched. Because this was the moment he had been waiting for. Grace turned to him, her eyes searching his face, not for sympathy, but for something else. Understanding. "I didn't take it," she said. Soft, steady, honest, but in a room already filled with doubt. Truth wasn't always enough. Omar held her gaze, said nothing. And in that silence, everything became uncertain. Because for the first time since this began, no one knew who he believed. The silence after Grace's words didn't last long. It cracked under the weight of judgment. "I saw her near the private wing yesterday," someone whispered from the line of staff. "She always lingers," another added, "like she's looking for something." "Of course she is," a third voice muttered. "People like her don't end up here by accident." The comments spread quickly, low, sharp, cutting deeper than any accusation Harold could have made on his own. Grace stood still. She didn't defend herself again, didn't argue, because she knew exactly how this worked. Once suspicion took hold, truth didn't matter anymore. Harold stepped forward, his expression measured, almost regretful. "Sir," he said to Omar, "I recommend we handle this swiftly. Theft within the household cannot be tolerated." Omar's gaze remained fixed on Grace, unmoving, unreadable. "Open the rest of the bag," he said. The staff member obeyed. One by one, items were placed on the table. A worn wallet, a small notebook, a folded piece of paper. Nothing of value. Nothing that matched the velvet box now sitting like evidence in the center of the room. Grace watched it, her heart pounding, because she knew she had never touched it, never even seen it before. And yet, there it was, in her bag, placed there with precision, with intent. "This is exactly why we have rules," Harold continued calmly. "Trust is a privilege, not a right." Grace's fingers tightened, not from fear, from restraint, because she understood something no one else in that room did. This wasn't just about the necklace. It was about silencing her. She lifted her eyes slowly, met Harold's gaze, and for a brief moment, something passed between them. Recognition. Confirmation. He knew she knew, and that made her dangerous. Omar noticed it. The shift. Subtle, but real. He turned slightly, addressing the room. "No one leaves," he said, "not until this is resolved." The tension spiked immediately. Staff exchanged uneasy glances, because now, this was no longer just about Grace. It was about everyone. Harold's smile returned, faint but controlled. "Of course, sir," he said. "Full cooperation is essential." Grace exhaled slowly, her chest rising and falling with measured control. Then she spoke. "There's more." The words were quiet, but they cut through the room instantly. Omar's eyes sharpened. Harold didn't move, but something behind his calm expression shifted. "What do you mean?" Omar asked. Grace hesitated, just for a second, because this was the line she hadn't wanted to cross, the one that would change everything. "You're not the only one who knows about the safe," she said. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Harold's voice came quickly, firm. "Careful, Grace. Accusations without proof will only make things worse for you." Grace didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on Omar. "I've seen people go into your office at night," she said, "when you weren't home." The room fell silent again. This time, heavier, more dangerous. Omar didn't interrupt. "Who?" he asked. Grace's lips parted, then closed again. Because she knew. She knew exactly what would happen if she said it. Her daughter's face flashed in her mind. Lily. Small. Fragile. Connected to machines in a hospital room that depended on every dollar Grace earned. And then, the message. The one she had received just hours earlier. A number she didn't recognize. No name, no warning. Just a single line. "Stay quiet, or your daughter pays the price." Grace's hands trembled slightly. She clenched them tighter, trying to stop it, trying to hold herself together. Omar noticed. Of course he did. He missed nothing. "Finish what you were saying," he said quietly. Grace swallowed. Her voice, when it came, was softer now. "I can't." The words landed harder than any accusation. Harold stepped forward again, seizing the moment. "Sir, this is exactly what I was referring to," he said. "Deflection, fabrication. She's trying to redirect attention." Grace shook her head. "No," she said. "I'm trying to protect." She stopped herself. Too late. Harold's eyes narrowed. "Protect what?" he pressed. Grace didn't answer. Couldn't, because the truth was no longer just about her. It was about someone else, someone who couldn't defend herself. Omar's gaze darkened slightly. "Who are you protecting?" he asked. Grace looked at him, and for a moment, everything else disappeared. The whispers, the judgment, the pressure. It was just the two of them, and the truth sitting between them. "I'm protecting someone who doesn't deserve this," she said. The room stirred again. Confusion, doubt, suspicion. Harold let out a quiet, disapproving sigh. "Sir, I strongly advise immediate termination," he said, "before this escalates further." Grace didn't react, didn't plead, didn't beg, because she had already made her choice. Omar turned slightly, his attention shifting back to the table, to the necklace, to the evidence. And then, he did something no one expected. He reached out, picked up the velvet box, opened it, examined the necklace inside. Slowly, carefully, as if searching for something beyond its surface. Then he closed it again and looked back at Grace. His expression hadn't softened, but it had changed, just enough. "Did you take this?" he asked. The question was direct, final. Grace met his gaze without hesitation. "No," she said. Her voice didn't shake this time. It didn't waver. It didn't ask to be believed. It simply existed. Truth. Omar held her gaze for a long moment. Then, he nodded once, as if filing something away. "Search the rest of the staff," he said. The room erupted again. "What? That's ridiculous, but you can't be serious." Harold's composure slipped. Only for a second. "Sir," he said quickly, "that won't be necessary. We've already identified the—" "I said search everyone," Omar repeated. Calm. Cold. Unmovable. The authority in his voice ended the argument instantly, because in that moment, the control Harold thought he had was starting to crack. Grace stood still, watching, breathing, waiting, because now the game had changed. And for the first time since this began, she wasn't the only one in danger. The search changed everything. One by one, the staff stepped forward, their belongings examined under Omar's silent supervision. Bags were opened, pockets emptied, phones checked. The process was slow, methodical, and deeply uncomfortable. No one was spared, not even Harold. The head butler maintained his composure as his coat was inspected, his expression calm, his posture unshaken. But the tension in the room had shifted. What had begun as a simple accusation was now uncertainty, and uncertainty made people nervous. Grace remained where she stood, slightly apart from the others, her hands still clasped together. She didn't speak, didn't look around. She waited, because she knew. This wouldn't clear her. Not yet. Harold had planned this too carefully. Omar observed every reaction, every flicker of unease, every forced breath, and when the last person had been searched, nothing else was found, no missing items, no additional evidence, just the necklace that had appeared in Grace's bag. The room fell into a heavy silence. Harold stepped forward again, reclaiming control. "Sir," he said, his voice steady, "this confirms what we already know. The item was found in her possession. No further proof is required." Grace closed her eyes for a brief second. There it was. The final push. The moment everything collapsed. Or the moment something else began. Omar didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned away, walked slowly toward the large window at the far end of the hall, his back to the room, his thoughts unreadable. The silence stretched. Uncomfortable. Uncertain. Then, "Everyone is dismissed," he said. The words landed like a shockwave. "What?" someone whispered. Harold frowned. "Sir, with all due respect, this matter is not resolved." "It is for now," Omar said, without turning. The authority in his voice ended the argument. Staff hesitated, then slowly began to leave. Whispers followed them. Eyes lingered on Grace, judging, curious, some even satisfied. Because to them, the outcome was obvious. Only 3 people remained when the room emptied. Omar, Grace, and Harold. Omar turned back slowly. His gaze moved between them, then settled on Harold. "You may go," he said. Harold didn't move. For the first time, there was resistance in his posture. "Sir," he said carefully, "I strongly advise—" "I didn't ask for your advice." The interruption was quiet, but final. Harold's jaw tightened, just slightly. Then he nodded. "Of course." He turned, walked toward the door, and just before stepping out, he paused, glanced back. At Grace, the look in his eyes wasn't anger, it was warning. Then he left. The door closed behind him, and the room fell silent again. Omar waited a few seconds, then spoke. Sit. Grace blinked. The word surprised her, but she obeyed, slowly lowering herself into the nearest chair, her hands still trembling slightly. Omar remained standing, watching her. Not as an employer, not as an accuser, but as someone trying to understand something deeper. "You had a chance to accuse him," he said. Grace looked up. "I know. Why didn't you?" The question lingered, heavy, unavoidable. Grace hesitated, then exhaled slowly. "Because it wouldn't have mattered," she said. Omar raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Grace looked down at her hands, at the faint marks of long hours of work, at the life she carried in silence. "He's been here longer than I have," she said. "People trust him. They believe him. And you think they wouldn't believe you?" Grace gave a small, humorless smile. "Would you have?" The question hung between them. Omar didn't answer. "Because the truth was complicated," Grace continued, her voice softer now. "It's not just about me," she said. Omar's gaze sharpened slightly. "Then what is it about?" Grace didn't respond immediately. Her mind drifted somewhere else, somewhere far from the mansion, from the accusations, from the weight of the moment, a small hospital room, white walls, soft beeping machines, and a little girl lying in bed, her tiny hand wrapped around Grace's finger. Lily, 6 years old, too young to understand why her mother couldn't always stay, too young to know how close they were to losing everything. Grace swallowed hard. "My daughter," she said quietly. Omar didn't move, but something in his expression shifted, just slightly. "She's sick," Grace continued. "She needs treatment. Regular treatment." Her voice didn't break, but it came close. "I can't lose this job," she said. "Not right now." Omar studied her, carefully. "Harold knows this," he said. It wasn't a question. Grace nodded. "Yes. And he's using it." Another nod. Silence followed. Long. Heavy. Omar turned away again, walked slowly across the room, his mind moving through the pieces. The threat. The silence. The choice Grace had made. Not out of weakness, but out of necessity. "You received a message," he said suddenly. Grace froze. "How did you—" "You're not hiding it well," Omar replied calmly. Grace looked down, her fingers tightening slightly. "It was this morning," she admitted. "After the meeting." "What did it say?" She hesitated, then reached into her pocket, pulled out her phone, and handed it to him. Omar took it, read the message. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. "Stay quiet, or your daughter pays the price." He looked back at her. "Why didn't you show me this earlier?" Grace met his gaze. "Because I didn't know if I could trust you." The honesty in her voice was immediate, unfiltered. Omar held her gaze for a long moment. Then, he nodded, as if accepting it, because in her position, he might have done the same. He handed the phone back, and for the first time since this began, the situation became clear. This wasn't just about theft or betrayal, it was about control, fear, leverage, and the people caught in between. Omar exhaled slowly, then said, "You're not losing your job." Grace blinked, surprised. "But you're also not staying in that house tonight," he added. Her confusion deepened. "What do you mean?" Omar's expression turned cold, focused, decisive. I mean, he said, if they're threatening your daughter. He paused, just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. Then this is no longer just my problem. Grace stared at him, because in that moment, everything shifted, and the line between employer and ally began to disappear. Omar didn't waste time. Within minutes, arrangements were already in motion. Calls were made, not through his usual channels, but through a private line only a handful of people knew existed. Instructions were given in short, precise sentences. No names, no unnecessary details. Grace stood near the doorway, watching, trying to understand how everything had shifted so quickly. An hour ago, she had been standing in the center of the hall, accused, humiliated, ready to lose everything. Now, she was being told to leave the mansion for her own safety, to trust the very man she had just admitted she didn't fully trust. It didn't make sense. And yet, something in Omar's tone left no room for doubt. "You'll go to the hospital," he said, ending the call and turning back to her. "Stay with your daughter." Grace hesitated. "What about here?" she asked. Omar's expression didn't change. "I'll handle it." The confidence in those words was absolute, but Grace shook her head. "You don't understand," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "They're not just stealing things. They're looking for something specific." Omar stepped closer. "Then tell me what it is." Grace took a breath. This was the moment she had been avoiding, the line she hadn't wanted to cross. But there was no turning back now. "I don't know exactly what it is," she admitted. "But I've seen the way they search. They're not taking valuables. They're looking through files, documents, drives." Omar's gaze sharpened. "That narrows it down." Grace shook her head again. "There's more." She reached into her pocket, pulled out something small. Metal, a flash drive. Omar's eyes dropped to it instantly. "This," she said, holding it carefully. "I didn't find it. I took it." The admission hung in the air. Omar didn't react immediately, but his attention had fully locked onto the object in her hand. "From where?" he asked. Grace swallowed. "Harold's office?" Omar's expression darkened slightly. "Explain." Grace stepped forward, placing the USB drive on the table between them. "I wasn't supposed to be there," she said. "I was cleaning the hallway outside. The door was open. He wasn't inside." She paused, her fingers tightening slightly as she remembered. "I saw him earlier that night," she continued, "talking to someone. He looked nervous. Different." Omar listened without interrupting. "So I went in," she said. "Just for a second. I didn't touch anything at first, but then I saw this on his desk." She gestured to the drive. "It didn't belong there," she said. "Everything in that office is always perfectly arranged. This wasn't." Omar nodded slightly. A detail like that mattered. "And you took it." Grace nodded. "I didn't know what was on it. I just knew it was important." "And you didn't tell anyone?" Grace let out a quiet breath. "I didn't know who I could tell." The honesty was immediate, unfiltered. Omar studied her for a moment longer, then picked up the USB drive, turned it over in his hand. Simple, unmarked. But whatever was inside it had already set everything in motion. He moved toward his desk, inserted the drive into his private system. The screen lit up instantly. A series of files appeared. Encrypted. Locked. Omar's jaw tightened slightly. "Password protected," he said. Grace stepped closer. "There was one file that wasn't," she added. Omar clicked through the folders. Found it. A single audio file. He pressed play. Static filled the room for a brief second. Then, voices. "This is the last time," someone said. Harold. There was no mistaking it. "You said that before," another voice replied. Lower, controlled, familiar, but not immediately identifiable. Omar's eyes narrowed. "You'll get what you want," Harold continued. "But we do this my way, and your way almost got us caught." A pause. "Then, he's not as careful as you think," Harold said. "He trusts the system too much." Omar's expression went cold, because that wasn't just observation. It was knowledge, detailed knowledge, of how he operated. Grace watched him carefully. "You hear it too," she said softly. Omar didn't answer, but his silence confirmed it. The second voice wasn't random. It wasn't an outsider. It was someone who knew him, knew his habits, knew his security. The audio continued. "We find it tonight," the voice said. "No more delays." "And if we don't?" Harold asked. "Then everything we've built falls apart." The file ended. Silence filled the room again. Heavy. Unsettling. Grace exhaled slowly. "That's not all," she said. Omar looked at her. "There are other files," she continued. "But they're locked. I couldn't open them." Omar turned back to the screen. His fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, trying access points, testing patterns. Nothing worked. "This wasn't meant to be opened easily," he said. Grace nodded. "But it was meant to be found." Omar paused, turned his head slightly toward her. "What do you mean?" Grace hesitated, then said, "They didn't hide it well enough." The implication settled between them. This wasn't just evidence, it was bait, a piece left behind intentionally. Omar leaned back slightly, his mind moving faster now, connecting pieces. Harold, the unknown voice, the break-ins, the safe, the threat against Grace's daughter. This wasn't random. It wasn't even just betrayal. It was coordinated, planned, and far more dangerous than it had seemed at first. A sudden knock at the door interrupted the silence. 3 sharp taps. Controlled. Omar's gaze shifted instantly. Grace froze, because they both knew there was only one person who would knock like that. Harold. Omar removed the USB drive, slipped it into his pocket, then looked at Grace. One silent instruction passed between them. "Say nothing." The knock came again. "Sir?" Harold's voice called from the other side. "May I come in?" Omar didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, just long enough to shift the balance. Then, "Enter." The door opened slowly. Harold stepped inside. His expression calm, his posture perfect. But his eyes went immediately to Grace, then to Omar, then, briefly, to the desk, as if searching for something, or confirming it wasn't there. "Is everything all right, sir?" he asked. Omar held his gaze, unblinking. "Tell me, Harold," he said quietly. "When exactly did you decide to betray me?" The room went completely still, because in that moment, the game was no longer hidden, and there was no turning back. Harold didn't flinch, not at the accusation, not at the weight behind Omar's voice. If anything, he seemed calmer. A faint smile touched the corner of his lips, controlled, practiced, almost respectful. "I'm not sure I understand what you mean, sir," he said evenly. The denial came too quickly, too smoothly. Grace felt it immediately. This wasn't fear. This was preparation. Omar stepped forward slowly, closing the distance between them. His gaze didn't waver. "You understand perfectly," he said. "You've had access, opportunity, and now, motive." Harold inclined his head slightly. "Accusations without evidence can be dangerous," he replied, "especially in a household built on trust." The words echoed in the room, twisted, reversed. Omar's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes sharpened. "Then let's talk about evidence," he said. Grace held her breath, because she knew what was coming. Or at least, she thought she did. Omar turned slightly, walking past Harold toward the center of the room. "Gather everyone," he said. Harold hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, then nodded. "As you wish." The hall filled again, faster this time. Word had already spread. Something was happening, something bigger than before. Staff gathered with nervous energy, whispering, watching, waiting. Grace stood off to the side, not hidden, but not protected either. She could feel the eyes on her. The judgment hadn't disappeared. It had only changed. Now it was mixed with curiosity, suspicion, anticipation. Omar entered last. The room fell silent instantly. He didn't take his usual position, didn't stand elevated. Instead, he remained on the same level as everyone else. Closer, more direct. "Earlier today," he began, "an accusation was made." His voice carried effortlessly. Calm, controlled, but heavy with intent. "A member of this staff was identified as a thief." A ripple moved through the room. Eyes turned toward Grace again. Omar noticed, but didn't stop it. "Before we go further," he continued, "I want to be clear about something." He paused, letting the silence settle. "I don't tolerate dishonesty." The words landed firmly, unmistakably. Grace felt her chest tighten, because for a brief moment, she didn't know which direction this was going. Omar turned, looked directly at her. "Step forward." The command was simple, final. Grace obeyed. Every step felt heavier than the last. She stopped in front of him, her hands at her sides, her posture straight, her eyes steady. Omar studied her. Then he looked away, turning instead to the rest of the staff. "The item in question was found in her possession," he said. A murmur spread instantly. Harold stepped forward slightly, his presence smooth, confident. "Sir, as I mentioned earlier, the evidence is quite clear." Omar raised a hand, silencing him without a word. The room stilled again. "Clear," Omar repeated. "Yes." He walked slowly toward the table at the center of the room. The velvet box sat there, waiting. He picked it up, opened it, let the light catch the necklace inside. "This," he said, "is a family heirloom." His voice remained calm, but there was something beneath it now. Something harder. "It does not leave my private collection." He closed the box, set it down again, then turned back. "Grace Miller," he said. Her name echoed through the hall. She met his gaze. "Yes, sir. Did you take it?" The question was the same as before, but now it carried far more weight. Grace didn't hesitate. "No." Her voice was steady, clear, unshaken. The room reacted instantly. Whispers, skepticism, disbelief. Harold let out a quiet breath. as if disappointed. "As expected," he said softly. Omar didn't look at him. Instead, he took a step back. Creating space between himself and Grace, between the truth and perception. "Then explain how it ended up in your bag," Omar said. Grace's heart pounded, because she knew. This was the moment, the turning point. "I didn't put it there," she said. "That's not an explanation." "It's the truth." The exchange was sharp, direct, unforgiving. Omar's expression remained unreadable. "You expect me to believe that someone placed it in your bag without your knowledge?" Grace held his gaze. "Yes." The word was simple, but it cut through the room, because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't desperate. It was certain. Harold stepped forward again. "I'm afraid this is becoming unproductive," he said. "We are wasting time on a matter that has already been resolved." Grace turned toward him. Her eyes burned now, not with fear, but with something stronger. "You set me up," she said. The accusation rang out, louder than before. The room froze. Harold didn't react, not immediately. Then he smiled. Faint. Controlled. "Be careful," he said quietly. "False accusations have consequences." Grace's hands clenched. "You've been watching me," she continued, "waiting for a chance to get rid of me." Harold tilted his head slightly. "And why would I do that?" Grace took a step forward. Because now, there was nothing left to lose. "Because I saw you," she said. The words hung in the air. Heavy. Dangerous. Harold's eyes narrowed slightly. "Doing what?" he asked. Grace opened her mouth, then stopped. The message flashed in her mind again. "Stay quiet, or your daughter pays the price." Her breath caught. Just for a second, but it was enough. Harold saw it, and in that moment, he knew. She wasn't going to say it. He turned back to Omar. "Sir," he said calmly, "this is exactly what I warned you about. Desperation. Fabrication. She's trying to create doubt where none exists." The room shifted again, because doubt was easier to believe than truth. Omar watched all of it. Every reaction, every hesitation, every calculated move. Then, he did something no one expected. He nodded. Once. Slowly. "As of this moment," he said, "Grace Miller is suspended from her duties." The words hit like a shockwave. Grace's chest tightened, but she didn't speak, didn't react. Because something in his tone didn't feel final. Harold's relief was immediate, though he hid it well. "I'll make the necessary arrangements," he said. Omar raised a hand again, stopping him. "She will remain on the premises," Omar added. Harold's expression faltered, just slightly. "Sir?" "Until I decide otherwise." The authority in his voice left no room for argument. The room fell silent again, because now nothing was certain. Not the accusation, not the outcome, not even the truth. Grace stood still, her heart racing, her mind spinning, because she didn't know what Omar was doing, didn't know what he believed. All she knew was this: the game had changed again, and the next move would decide everything. The hall didn't empty right away. Even after Omar's announcement, no one moved at first. The air felt thick, charged with something no one could name but everyone could feel. Suspended. Unresolved. Grace stood where she was, her pulse loud in her ears. Suspended. Not dismissed. Not cleared. Held in place like a piece on a board she couldn't fully see. Harold recovered first. "Everyone return to your duties," he said, voice steady, reclaiming order. "We will proceed as instructed." This time, the staff obeyed. Slowly. Reluctantly. They began to disperse, their whispers trailing behind them like a shadow. Eyes lingered on Grace. Then on Omar. Then on Harold. Because something had shifted. And no one trusted the surface anymore. Within minutes, the hall emptied. Only the three of them remained again. Omar stood at the center, still as stone, Harold near the doorway, Grace between them, caught in a silence that felt heavier than any accusation. Omar turned slightly. "Stay," he said. It wasn't directed at Grace. It was for Harold. The butler paused, then stepped forward again, composed. "Of course, sir." Omar gestured toward the long table. "Sit." Harold hesitated, a fraction of a second, then complied. Grace remained standing. Omar didn't ask her to sit. Instead, he walked to the far end of the table and opened a slim black case. Inside was a portable projector. He set it up with practiced ease, connecting it to his private system. Harold watched, expression unreadable, but his fingers tightened briefly against the armrest. "What is this?" he asked. "A meeting," Omar replied. Harold gave a small, polite smile. "I thought we had just concluded one." Omar met his gaze. "That was a rehearsal." The words settled slowly. Uneasily, Grace felt her breath catch. Because something in Omar's tone had changed. This wasn't observation anymore. This was control. A soft hum filled the room as the projector powered on. The far wall lit up. A blank screen, then footage appeared. Grainy. Low light. But clear enough. Harold's office. Late at night. Grace's eyes widened. Because she recognized it instantly. The angle. The desk. The exact moment. A figure entered the room. Harold. He moved quickly, opened a drawer, took something out, then paused. As if listening. His head turned slightly toward the door. Then, another figure stepped into view. The same one from the study. The man from the night before. Harold spoke. The audio was faint at first, then sharpened. "We don't have much time," he said. The second man responded, his voice low. "You said he wouldn't be back." "I said he wasn't supposed to be," Harold replied. Grace felt her stomach drop, because this wasn't just suspicion anymore. This was proof. Harold didn't look at the screen. Not yet. Instead, he looked at Omar. Calm. Measured. "You've been monitoring my office," he said. It wasn't a question. Omar didn't answer directly. "I monitor everything that belongs to me," he said. Harold inclined his head slightly. "As is your right." The footage continued. Harold placed a small object into a drawer, then closed it. The second man stepped closer. "What about the girl?" he asked. Grace froze. Harold's voice came next. "I'm handling her." The words echoed. Cold. Precise. Grace's hands trembled slightly. Because now, there was no doubt. Harold had known. From the beginning. Omar stepped forward. Paused the footage. The screen froze on Harold's face. Clear. Undeniable. "Would you like to explain this?" Omar asked. Harold finally turned his head, looked at the screen, studied it. Then, he smiled. Faint. Controlled. "That depends," he said. On what you think it proves." Grace blinked, confusion flickering across her face. Because that wasn't denial. It wasn't panic. It was something else. Confidence. Omar's eyes narrowed slightly. "It proves you've been lying," he said. Harold shook his head. "No," he replied. "It proves I've been careful." The words hung in the air, twisted. Omar didn't move. "Careful about what?" he asked. Harold leaned back slightly in his chair. Relaxed, composed. "As I said before, sir," he began, "accusations without full context can be misleading." Grace felt a chill run through her. Because something wasn't right. This wasn't the reaction of someone cornered. This was the reaction of someone who expected this moment. Omar seemed to sense it too, because instead of pressing further, he reached into his pocket, pulled out the USB drive, and placed it on the table, between them. Harold's eyes flicked to it, just for a second, then back to Omar. "Shall we continue?" Omar said. He inserted the drive, brought up the audio file, pressed play. The voices filled the room again. Clearer this time. Sharper. "We find it tonight," the second voice said. "And if we don't?" Harold asked. "Then everything we've built falls apart." The audio ended. Silence followed. Heavy. Measured. Omar looked directly at Harold. "You've been working with someone," he said. Harold didn't deny it, didn't confirm it either. Instead, he tilted his head slightly. "You're asking the wrong question," he said. Grace's breath caught, because something in his tone had shifted. Subtly, but unmistakably. Omar's gaze hardened. "Then enlighten me," he said. Harold leaned forward, his eyes steady, focused. "And what exactly," he asked quietly, "do you think they're looking for?" The question landed differently, because it wasn't defensive, it was probing, testing. Omar didn't answer immediately, but something in his expression changed. A realization. Small, but significant. Because suddenly, this wasn't just about betrayal, or theft, or even control. It was about something else, something hidden, something important enough to risk everything. Grace felt it too. The shift, the deeper layer beneath everything they had seen so far. Omar straightened slowly. His voice, when he spoke again, was quieter, more dangerous. "You already know the answer," he said. Harold smiled again, this time just slightly wider. "Yes," he said, "I do." The room fell silent, because in that moment, the truth wasn't just beginning to surface. It was about to break through completely. The silence after Harold's last words didn't feel empty. It felt loaded, as if something invisible had just shifted into place. Omar didn't respond right away. He stood still, eyes fixed on Harold, measuring not just his words, but the confidence behind them. Because that was the problem. Harold wasn't afraid, not even now. And fear, in situations like this, was usually the first crack. But there were none. Only control, only calculation. Grace felt it too. Standing a few steps away, she watched the two men like she was witnessing something far larger than herself. A game that had been unfolding long before she ever realized she was part of it. Omar finally moved. Slowly, deliberately. He stepped around the table, closing the distance again. "You're right," he said quietly. Harold's eyes flickered, just slightly. Not with surprise, but with interest. Am I? He asked. Omar stopped directly in front of him, close enough that there was no distance left to hide behind. This isn't just about theft, Omar continued, and it's not just about you. Harold didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression almost curious. Then you've started to understand, he said. Grace's breath caught, because something in the tone of that exchange had changed again. This wasn't interrogation anymore. It was recognition. Omar turned away from Harold and walked back toward the screen. The frozen image of Harold's face still stared out from it, unmoving, captured, but no longer enough. You've had access to my systems for years, Omar said, his voice calm but cutting. You know my routines, my habits, my security protocols. He paused, then added, but you don't have the authority to override them. Harold smiled faintly. No, he agreed. I don't. The admission came easily, too easily. Omar turned back. And yet, he continued, someone does. The room seemed to tighten around those words. Grace felt her pulse quicken. Because this was the piece she hadn't seen. The part that didn't fit. Harold had access. But not enough. Not alone. Omar's gaze locked onto him. Who are you working with? The question was direct, sharp, unavoidable. Harold didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked past Omar, at Grace, just for a second. And in that second, something cold passed through the room. A warning. A reminder. Grace felt it like a chill down her spine, but this time, she didn't look away. Omar noticed. Of course he did. His expression hardened slightly. Then he spoke again. This is your last opportunity, he said. Tell me who's behind this. Harold exhaled slowly, then stood up. The movement was calm, controlled, as if he were no longer bound by the situation at all. You're still thinking too small, he said. Omar didn't move. Am I? He asked. Harold nodded once. Yes. He walked a few steps forward, stopping just short of the table. This was never about breaking into your safe, he continued, or stealing a necklace, or even accessing your files. Grace frowned, confusion flickering across her face. Then what? What is it about? Omar asked. Harold's eyes met his. Steady, unflinching. Control, he said. The words settled heavily. Not dramatic, not loud, but final. Omar's gaze darkened. You already have a position of control, he said. In this house. In this system. Harold shook his head. Not real control, he replied. Not the kind that matters. He gestured slightly toward the projector. Everything you've built, he said, relies on information, data, decisions made in rooms like this. Grace's mind raced. Because now, she was starting to understand. Harold wasn't just stealing, he was positioning, preparing. For what? Omar asked. Harold smiled again. But this time, there was something sharper behind it. For the moment you stop being the one in charge. The words hit harder than anything before. Grace felt her chest tighten. Because that wasn't just betrayal. That was intention. Omar didn't react immediately, but the stillness in his posture deepened. Cold. Focused. You're planning to replace me, he said. Harold tilted his head slightly. Not me, he corrected. The distinction was small, but it changed everything. Omar's eyes narrowed. Then who? Harold didn't answer. Instead, he glanced toward the door, just briefly, but long enough. Omar saw it. Grace saw it. And in that moment, they both understood. This wasn't over, not even close. Omar stepped forward again, faster this time, his voice lower, more dangerous. "You've been inside my house," he said, "inside my systems. You've threatened one of my employees and her family." He paused, just long enough for the weight of it to settle. "And you expect me to let you walk out of here?" Harold didn't move, didn't retreat, didn't defend himself. Instead, he smiled. Calm. Certain. "You won't," he said. The certainty in his voice was absolute, and that was what made it dangerous. Omar's gaze sharpened further. "Then explain why you're still standing," he said. Harold's answer came without hesitation. "Because you still need me." The room fell silent again. Because this time, the words didn't sound like arrogance. They sounded like truth. Grace's heart pounded, because suddenly, everything felt bigger than she had imagined. More complex. More dangerous. Omar held Harold's gaze, unblinking. Then, slowly, he nodded. Not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because Harold was right about one thing. This wasn't finished. Not yet. And whatever came next would reveal everything. Omar turned his head slightly, toward the door, then said, "Bring him in." Grace's breath caught, because she hadn't seen anyone enter, hadn't heard anything. But the moment Omar spoke, the door opened, and footsteps echoed into the room. Slow, confident, familiar. Grace turned instinctively, her eyes widening, because the man who stepped inside was someone she had seen before, many times, but never like this, never as part of something like this. And in that moment, everything she thought she understood began to fall apart. The man who stepped into the room did not hurry. He didn't need to. Confidence carried him forward, each step measured, deliberate, as if he were walking into a meeting he had already prepared for. Grace stared. Because she knew him. Everyone in the house knew him. Daniel Karim, Omar's cousin, a frequent guest, a man who had always arrived with easy smiles, polished manners, and the quiet authority that came from being part of the same powerful family. He had dined in this hall, shaken hands with investors, spoken respectfully to the staff, even to her. Grace felt her chest tighten. Because now, every memory of him shifted. Every interaction felt different. Daniel's gaze moved briefly across the room, from Omar to Harold, then, finally, to Grace. He paused there for just a fraction of a second, long enough for recognition to pass between them. Then he smiled, calm, unbothered. "As expected," he said. The words settled into the room like a spark landing in dry air. Omar didn't respond immediately. He watched Daniel carefully. Not as family, not as an equal, but as a variable that had just revealed itself. "You're late," Omar said. Daniel shrugged lightly. "Traffic," he replied. The casual tone didn't match the moment, and that was exactly the point. Grace swallowed, her hands tightening at her sides, because suddenly, everything made sense. The second voice in the recording, the access, the confidence. This wasn't an outsider. This was someone who belonged. Someone who had always belonged. Omar stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "You've been busy," he said. Daniel's smile widened slightly. "Only as much as necessary." Grace felt the weight of those words. Necessary. As if everything that had happened, the break-ins, the threats, the manipulation, had been justified. Omar's eyes darkened. "You used my house," he said. "My systems, my people." Daniel tilted his head. "I used what was available." The response was smooth, calculated, unapologetic. Grace felt anger rise in her chest. Because to him, this wasn't betrayal, it was strategy. Omar's voice dropped lower. "You threatened a child." For the first time, Daniel's expression shifted. Not with guilt, not with regret, but with irritation. "That wasn't personal," he said. "It was leverage." The word hit harder than anything before. Leverage. Grace's breath caught, because to him, Lily wasn't a person. She was a tool, something to be used. Omar took another step forward, close enough now that the tension between them felt physical. "You crossed a line," he said. Daniel met his gaze. "And you built the line," he replied. The room went silent. Because this wasn't just confrontation. This was history. Unspoken. Buried. Now rising to the surface. Omar didn't react immediately, but something in his posture changed. Slight, controlled, dangerous. "You think this ends well for you?" he asked. Daniel smiled again. But this time, there was something colder behind it. "I think," he said slowly, "you're already too late." Grace felt a chill run through her. "Too late?" Omar's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Daniel gestured lightly toward the desk. "The files you're protecting," he said. "The ones in the safe." Grace's heart skipped. Because this was what everything had been about. Daniel continued. "They're not just data," he said. "They're control points, access keys, the kind of information that decides who runs your company and who doesn't." Omar didn't move, didn't speak. But his silence wasn't passive. It was focused. Listening. Calculating. "You thought you were the only one who understood their value," Daniel said. "But you underestimated how many people were paying attention." Grace looked between them. Because now, the scale of this wasn't just personal. It was corporate, financial, powerful. Harold stepped forward slightly. "Everything was in place," he said. "The access, the timing, the cover." Grace turned toward him, shock flashing across her face. "You were going to destroy him," she said. Harold didn't deny it. "We were going to replace him," he corrected. The distinction mattered. To them. To their plan. Omar's gaze shifted between them. Then, he did something unexpected. He smiled. Not wide, not obvious, but enough. And it changed everything. Daniel noticed it instantly. His expression tightened, just slightly. "Something funny?" he asked. Omar's voice, when he spoke, was calm, almost quiet. "Yes," he said. The single word carried weight, confidence, control. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Care to share?" Omar stepped back, creating space again. Between them. Between the tension. Between the outcome. "I wanted to be sure," he said. Grace blinked, confusion flickering across her face. Sure of what? Daniel frowned. For weeks, Omar continued, I've been watching small inconsistencies, access logs that didn't match, systems that reset at unusual times. He paused, then added, but I didn't know how deep it went. The room went still. Because now, the direction of the conversation had shifted. Again. Omar looked directly at Daniel. And now I do. Daniel's expression hardened. You're bluffing. Omar shook his head. No, he said. Then, he reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, pressed a single button, and held it up. A screen lit up. Live feed. Multiple angles. Multiple rooms. Security cameras. Restored. Active. Grace's eyes widened. Because the cameras, the ones Harold had disabled, were back. Omar's gaze didn't leave Daniel. You said I trusted the system too much, he said. A slight pause. Then, I fixed that. The weight of those words settled heavily, because in that moment, the balance of power shifted completely. Daniel's confidence cracked. Not fully, but enough. Even if that's true, he said, you still don't have everything. Omar didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the door and said, Bring them in. Footsteps echoed again, heavier this time, more deliberate. Grace turned, her heart pounding. Because whatever came next would decide everything. And as the door opened once more, the truth was no longer something hidden. It was about to be undeniable. The door opened. Two men stepped inside first, formal, composed, unmistakably not part of the household staff. Their suits were plain, their expressions neutral, but the authority they carried was clear. Behind them, another figure entered. A woman, mid-40s, sharp eyes, steady posture. Grace didn't recognize her, but Daniel did. His expression changed instantly, not dramatically, not enough for anyone careless to notice, but Omar saw it, and that was enough. Counsel, Omar said calmly. The woman inclined her head slightly. Mr. Al-Rashid. She stepped forward, placing a thin folder on the table. Behind her, the two men positioned themselves near the door. Silent. Observing. Daniel let out a slow breath. Lawyers, he said. You're escalating quickly. Omar didn't look at him. I'm concluding, he replied. Grace felt her pulse quicken. Because this was no longer hidden, no longer controlled behind whispers and shadows. This was exposure. The woman opened the folder. Inside were documents, printed, organized, precise. Over the past 6 weeks, she began, her voice clear and steady, there have been multiple unauthorized access attempts to Mr. Al-Rashid's private systems. She placed the first document on the table. Access logs, time-stamped. Another. Internal communications recovered from secured channels. Another. Financial transfers. Grace stared, because the pages kept coming. Layer after layer. Proof. Not assumptions. Not suspicions. Evidence. Harold's composure slipped. Not much, but enough. His jaw tightened, his shoulders stiffened. Daniel, however, remained still, watching, calculating. The woman continued. These records show repeated coordination between Mr. Harold Bennett and an external party with privileged access credentials. She paused, then added, Credentials that were traced back to Mr. Daniel Kareem. The room fell silent. Complete. Absolute. Grace felt it. That moment when truth stops being questioned and starts being accepted. Daniel didn't deny it, didn't interrupt. He simply stood there, taking it in. Omar finally turned to face him directly. "No more questions," he said. Daniel exhaled slowly, then smiled. Not wide, not arrogant, just resigned. "I suppose this is the part where you expect me to be surprised," he said. Omar didn't respond. Daniel glanced at the documents, then at Harold, then back at Omar. "You planned this," he said. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't anger. It was acknowledgement. Omar nodded slightly. "I confirmed it," he corrected. Grace's breath caught, because that meant this hadn't just happened overnight. Omar had been watching, waiting, building. Harold took a step back, almost instinctively. "This isn't what you think," he said. But the words lacked weight now, because the evidence was already there. Daniel turned his head slightly toward him. "Stop," he said quietly. Harold froze, because for the first time, Daniel wasn't supporting him. He was cutting him off. "This part is over," Daniel continued. Grace felt a strange shift, because suddenly, the man who had orchestrated everything was letting it go, not out of defeat, but out of understanding. Omar watched closely, because he knew this wasn't the end, not for Daniel. "Take them," Omar said. The two men by the door moved immediately. Professional. Efficient. They stepped forward, positioning themselves beside Harold. Harold's composure cracked fully now. "You can't do this," he said, his voice rising. "I built this place. I kept everything running." "You exploited it," Omar said. The interruption was cold, final. Harold's expression twisted. Anger, desperation, fear, all at once. He looked at Grace, then at Omar. "You think she's different?" he snapped. "She would have done the same if she had the chance." "Enough." Omar didn't raise his voice, but the word cut through everything. Harold fell silent, because in that moment, there was nothing left to say. The men moved him toward the door. Firm. Controlled. He didn't resist, not physically, but his eyes. They lingered. On Grace, on Omar, as if trying to leave something behind. A warning, a threat, or just regret. Then he was gone. The door closed behind him. Silence returned. But this time, it felt different, lighter, clearer. Daniel remained, unrestrained, unmoved. Omar turned back to him. "You're not walking out of here the same way," he said. Daniel nodded. "I figured." There was no resistance in his voice. No panic. Just acceptance. "But let's be honest," Daniel added. "This was never about winning or losing." Omar raised an eyebrow. "Then what was it about?" Daniel looked around the room. At the screen. At the documents. At the place that had been the center of everything. "Control," he said again. The same word. But this time, it felt different. Less like ambition. More like truth. "You built something powerful," Daniel continued. "Something people want." Omar didn't argue, because that part was true. "And people like me," Daniel said, "we don't wait for permission." Grace felt a chill run through her. Because even now, he wasn't apologizing. He wasn't regretting. He was explaining. Omar stepped closer. "And people like me," he said, "don't lose control." The two men moved again, positioning themselves beside Daniel. This time, he didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't even look surprised. He simply nodded once, then turned and walked out of the room, just like that. No struggle, no scene, just gone. The door closed, and for the first time since this began, the room was quiet. Truly quiet. Grace stood where she was, still processing, still trying to understand how everything had shifted so completely. Omar turned slowly, looked at her, and for a brief moment, the intensity in his expression softened. Not completely, but enough. "You should go," he said. Grace blinked. "Go?" "To the hospital," he clarified. She hesitated. Because part of her still didn't believe it was over, but another part knew exactly where she needed to be. She nodded slowly. "Thank you," she said. The words were simple, but they carried everything. Omar didn't respond. Not with words, but with something quieter. A decision already made. As Grace turned toward the door, one thought stayed with her. Everything had changed, but one question remained. What would happen next, now that the truth was finally out? The hospital smelled like antiseptic and quiet hope. Grace had walked through those doors so many times that the rhythm of the place felt familiar, almost like a second home she never wanted. The soft beeping of monitors, the low murmur of nurses, the steady shuffle of footsteps in the hall. It all blended into something she had learned to live with. But tonight, everything felt different. She moved quickly down the corridor, her heart racing, her thoughts still catching up with everything that had happened. The mansion, the accusations, the truth. Omar. It all felt unreal. Until she reached the door, room 214. She paused for just a second, took a breath, then pushed it open. "Mom?" The small voice cut through everything. "Lily." Grace's chest tightened instantly. Her daughter sat up in bed, her dark hair falling softly around her face, her eyes bright despite the pale tone of her skin. Tubes and wires still surrounded her, but for the first time in weeks, she looked stronger, more awake, more alive. Grace rushed to her side. "I'm here," she said, her voice soft but full. Lily smiled. "You came early today." Grace hesitated, then smiled back. "Yeah," she said. "Something changed." Lily tilted her head slightly. "What happened?" Grace brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "Nothing you need to worry about," she said gently. But Lily's eyes narrowed just a little. "You look different," she said. Grace blinked. "Different how?" "Less scared," Lily replied simply. The words landed quietly, but they stayed. Because they were true. Grace hadn't realized it until that moment. But something inside her had shifted. The fear that had been sitting in her chest for weeks was gone. Or at least, it wasn't controlling her anymore. A knock came at the door. Soft. Polite. Grace turned. And for a brief second, her heart skipped. Omar stood in the doorway. Still, composed, out of place in a hospital hallway, but somehow fitting into the moment without disrupting it. Lily noticed him instantly. "Who's that?" she whispered. Grace stood slowly. She started, then paused, because she didn't know how to explain it. Omar stepped forward slightly. Just someone who owes your mom an apology, he said calmly. Lily looked between them, curious, uncertain. Grace exhaled softly. He's my boss, she said. Lily's eyes widened slightly. Oh. Omar approached the bed, stopping at a respectful distance. He didn't reach out, didn't move too close. He simply looked at Lily, carefully, as if trying to understand something. You're Lily, he said. She nodded. Yes. Omar gave a small nod in return. I've heard a lot about you. Lily smiled faintly. Good things? Omar paused, then said, Only the important ones. Grace watched the exchange in silence, because something about it felt different. Omar wasn't speaking like a billionaire or a man used to control. He was speaking like someone who had stepped into a world he didn't fully understand yet, and was trying to. I'm sorry, he said, turning to Grace. The words were quiet, but they carried weight. For what happened today, he continued. I should have handled it differently. Grace shook her head slightly. You handled it, she said. That's what matters. Omar held her gaze for a moment, then nodded, as if accepting that, but not fully agreeing. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a folder, and placed it gently on the table beside Lily's bed. Grace frowned slightly. What is that? Something that should have been done earlier, Omar said. Grace stepped closer, opened the folder, and froze. Because inside were documents, medical approvals, payment confirmations, full coverage, every treatment Lily needed. Already approved, already paid for. Grace's breath caught. I don't understand, she whispered. Omar's expression remained calm. I looked into her case, he said, after yesterday. Grace looked up at him. Shock, disbelief, gratitude. All at once. You didn't have to do this, she said. Omar's response was immediate. Yes, he said. I did. The certainty in his voice left no room for argument. Grace's eyes filled slightly, not with tears, but with something deeper. Relief. Lily looked between them again. What's going on? She asked. Grace knelt beside her bed, her voice softer now. It means you're going to be okay, she said. Lily blinked, then smiled, a real smile, the kind that filled the room. Omar watched it, and something inside him shifted. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, but enough. Days passed, then weeks. The mansion returned to order, but not the same order as before. Harold was gone. Daniel's name disappeared from internal records. Security systems were rebuilt, stronger, smarter, more controlled. But inside that control, there was something new, something Omar hadn't allowed before. Trust, not given easily, not offered freely, but considered. Grace returned to the mansion, not as a maid, not as someone invisible, but as someone seen, respected, valued. The staff who had once whispered about her now spoke carefully in her presence, not out of fear, but out of recognition, because the truth had changed everything, and so had she. One afternoon, as Grace walked through the hallway she had once moved through quietly, unnoticed, she paused. A plaque had been placed near the entrance. New, simple, elegant. She stepped closer. Read the name. The Lily Foundation. Her breath caught again, because she understood immediately what it meant, what it represented, and what it would become. Omar stood a few steps behind her, silent, watching. "You didn't have to do that either," she said softly. Omar replied without hesitation. "Yes," he said. "I did." Grace turned slightly, looking at him, not as her employer, not as a billionaire, but as someone who had changed, and helped her change too. For the first time since this began, the future didn't feel uncertain. It felt possible. But even then, one quiet thought remained. How many lives would be changed next? The night of the event felt different from every other night the mansion had ever hosted. The lights were brighter, the music softer, the atmosphere lighter. For the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like something else, something open, something alive. Guests moved through the grand hall in elegant attire, their voices blending into a low, warm hum. Conversations flowed easily. Laughter echoed softly against the high ceilings. But beneath it all, there was purpose. At the center of the room stood a simple stage. No excessive decoration, no overwhelming display of wealth. Just a quiet focus. A name projected behind it. The Lily Foundation. Grace stood near the edge of the hall, her hands clasped lightly in front of her. She wore a dress she never imagined owning. Simple, but beautiful. Not chosen to impress. Chosen to belong. She still felt the difference. Not in the fabric, but in the way people looked at her. No longer past her. No longer through her. But at her. With recognition. With respect. Across the room, Omar stood among a group of investors and partners. His posture was the same as always, controlled, composed, precise. But there was something different in the way he spoke. Less distant, less guarded. As if the walls he had built around himself had shifted, just enough to let something through. Grace watched him for a moment, then looked away. Because this night wasn't about him, it wasn't even about her. It was about something bigger. A quiet signal came from the stage. A coordinator gestured toward her. It was time. Grace took a slow breath, then stepped forward. Each step toward the stage felt steady, grounded. Not because she wasn't nervous, but because she knew why she was there. The room gradually fell silent as she approached the microphone. Dozens of eyes turned toward her. Some curious, some respectful, some simply listening. Grace paused, just for a second, then began. "A few weeks ago," she said, her voice soft but clear, "I stood in this house and thought I was about to lose everything." The room remained still. No whispers, no interruptions, just attention. "I was accused of something I didn't do," she continued. "And for a moment, I believed that was the end of my story." She glanced briefly toward Omar, then back at the audience. "But what I didn't realize," she said, "was that sometimes, the moment you feel the most powerless is the moment everything begins to change." A quiet murmur moved through the room. Not disbelief. Understanding. Grace's voice remained steady. "I didn't have money," she said. "I didn't have influence. I didn't have anyone powerful standing behind me." She paused, then added, "But I had something else." The room leaned in. Choice. The word hung in the air. I could have stayed silent for the wrong reasons, she said. Or I could stay silent to protect someone who mattered more than myself. Her eyes softened slightly. My daughter. Lily sat near the front row, her small figure upright in her seat, watching her mother with quiet pride. Grace smiled faintly. And in that moment, she continued, I realized something important. She looked out across the room. At the end of the day, what we choose to protect defines who we are. The silence deepened. Because the truth in her words didn't need to be explained. It was felt. Grace took another breath, then stepped slightly to the side. Tonight isn't about me, she said. It's about every person who's ever been overlooked. Every person who's ever been judged too quickly. Every person who's ever felt like they didn't belong. Her voice grew stronger. But kindness doesn't disappear just because it's ignored, she said. And truth doesn't lose its value just because it's questioned. A few heads nodded in the crowd. Quietly, thoughtfully. Grace's gaze shifted once more, toward Omar, then back. And sometimes, she added, the people who have the most power are the ones who learn the most when they choose to see. She stepped back slightly, giving space. Because this part wasn't hers alone. Omar approached the stage, slow, measured, but not distant. He stopped beside her, looked out at the audience, then spoke. I built my life believing control was everything, he said. His voice was calm, familiar, but different. I believed that if I could manage every detail, anticipate every move, I could prevent anything from going wrong. He paused, then added, I was wrong. The admission settled into the room, heavy, honest. Because control without trust, he continued, is just isolation. Grace glanced at him, not surprised, just understanding. Omar looked toward Lily, then back at the audience. This foundation exists because one person chose to do the right thing, even when it cost her everything. He turned slightly toward Grace. And because of that, he said, we have the opportunity to change more than just one life. The room filled with quiet applause, not loud, not overwhelming, but real. Lily stood up, without hesitation, and walked toward the stage. Grace's breath caught, because she hadn't expected that. Lily climbed the steps slowly, then stood between them. Small, but steady. Omar looked down at her, then offered his hand. She took it, without fear, without hesitation. And in that moment, the room saw it. Not wealth, not power, but connection. Something genuine, something human. The applause grew stronger. But still, it wasn't about noise, it was about meaning. As the event continued, conversations shifted. People spoke differently, listened differently, because the story they had just heard wasn't just a story. It was a reminder that behind every title, every position, every appearance, there was a person. And sometimes, the ones who seem the smallest carry the greatest strength. True character is revealed not in moments of comfort, but in moments of pressure. Kindness, integrity, and courage may go unnoticed at first, but they never lose their value. Never judge someone by their appearance or status, because the quietest people often carry the strongest hearts and the deepest truths. If this story touched you, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. And don't forget to subscribe, because stories like this remind us who we really are.